Hey guys, tonight we take a step back in time, not to a battlefield, not to a royal court, but to somewhere far more dangerous. Your own kitchen. Picture this. You've just uncorked a bottle of beer, sliced a wedge of cheese, and you're halfway into a bubble bath when suddenly, bam, you're excommunicated. Yup, in medieval Europe, that evening of self-care might have earned you a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Because back then, the church didn't just oversee your Sunday mornings. It reached into your pantry, your mug, and even your bathtub, your diet, your drinks, and your hygiene rituals. Those were under ecclesiastical surveillance. Whether it was Gouda on a feast day or beer brewed on a Thursday, it was very much their business. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a muddy cobblestone street, your wooden clogs squelching slightly as you pass a sleepy village tucked under the ecclesiastical umbrella of 14th century France. Chimneys puff out lazy ribbons of smoke, and someone nearby is boiling something suspiciously cheese-scented in a cauldron. The church bell tolls, ominously, of course. It's not just a call to prayer, it's also your dinner bell, because eating hours were regulated by religious timekeeping. That pot of bubbling dairy could be trouble. The local priest once declared aged blue cheese a symbol of moral decay, literally. Rot of the rind, rot of the soul, he'd muttered, nose turned up. It didn't help that some peasant women started selling their miraculous healing cheese just outside the chapel, as if mold cured gout. This, you realize, is a world where the church quietly micromanages everything edible, drinkable, and wash-worthy. The average person didn't exactly read doctrine, but they knew what the priest liked and didn't like. That shaped markets, habits, and even family recipes. The sacred and the mundane were hopelessly entangled like wet laundry after a storm. You pass a tavern. It's technically closed. It's a minor feast day. But you hear the clink of mugs. The church allowed beer, yes, but only at very specific times, in very specific ways. Monks were allowed to drink it for sustenance during fasting. Liquid bread, they called it. But for regular folks? Well, that depended on your priest's mood and your proximity to Lent. And Lent. Don't get started on Lent. Cheese was exiled from your plate for 40 days. Unless you paid a little indulgence, of course. Then you could nibble a little Parmesan and say 5 Hail Marys to balance it out. Historians still argue whether this cheese forgiveness racket was genuine spiritual strategy or just a creamy form of corruption. But perhaps the oddest thing is how the church never officially said, no cheese ever. It was more like cheese was a theological wild card. Fresh cheese equals okay. Aged and fermented cheese, possibly demonic, depending on the bishop. Cheese with holes? Even worse, who knew what spirits might hide in there? Bathwater got the same treatment. You weren't forbidden from bathing exactly, but you were encouraged to be moderate. A clean soul mattered more than a clean neck, apparently. And soaking for pleasure? Absolutely not. If your bath had herbs, oils, or, heaven forbid, scented petals, you risked being called vain or unchaste. This was especially harsh on women, who bore the brunt of these suspicions. The idea that physical cleanliness could provoke spiritual filth is a paradox only medieval theology could conjure with such confidence. You sit now at a peasant's table. Imaginary, yes, but vividly textured. A loaf of dark rye, a chunk of goat cheese, and a wooden mug of watery ale. Not too much of any, of course. Gluttony was a sin, and the 7 deadly sins were terrifyingly well enforced. You eat, not just with your mouth, but with your conscience. That nibble of cheese, was it aged beyond the approved threshold? That ale, did it come from the monastery's brew barrels, or a questionable alewife on the edge of town? One bite could be holy, the next, heresy. Church regulation wasn't always brutal, though. Sometimes it was laughably local. In one village, the bishop banned cheese that had been wrapped in herbs associated with pagan traditions. Which herbs? The suspicious green ones. Very helpful. Elsewhere, beer had to be blessed before sale, with a ceremony longer than the brewing process itself. Monasteries, meanwhile, flourished as centers of beer and cheese perfection. They had the luxury of time, patience, and sacred loopholes. Monks kept detailed brewing records, some of which survive today, and refined cheese aging techniques that still inform European artisanal methods. The irony? The very institution that frowned upon indulgence was also the one perfecting it behind cloistered walls. You lean back, yes, we're reclining into the imagery now, and imagine the scent of old wood, warm hops, and something vaguely milky in the air. A monk passes, humming a hymn, while balancing a tray of double cream brie and a half-pint of golden ale. He's not sinning. He's surviving. In this world, food and drink weren't just sustenance. They were moral decisions. And that bath you planned better be for healing, not pleasure. The moment you sighed and leaned into it, well, someone might just write a sermon about your behavior next Sunday. And just think, we're only beginning. The deeper you go into this story, the more absurd and fascinating it becomes. Because when the church regulated cheese, beer, and bathwater, it wasn't just about control. It was about reshaping how people saw indulgence, purity, and the body itself. You didn't just wash your feet. You cleaned your conscience. You didn't just drink beer. You evaluated your soul's posture while you did it. And you didn't just eat cheese. You asked, quietly, nervously, is this cheese holy? You step through the worn wooden doors of a monastic brewery, the air rich with the scent of damp stone and fermenting barley. It's dim inside. Candles flicker in wrought iron sconces, casting long shadows over copper vats, and cloaked figures murmuring Latin blessings. These aren't just brewers. They're monks, and they're about to save you from both thirst and eternal damnation. You might think beer and religion make strange bedfellows, but in medieval Europe, monks were the original microbrewers. They brewed not to get tipsy on a Thursday, but to nourish the faithful, and, let's be honest, themselves during the long stretches of religious fasting. Food was forbidden. Liquid, divine loophole. They even had a motto, liquida non frangunt jejunum. Liquids do not break the fast. And beer, my friend, was gloriously liquid. As you tiptoe past barrels labeled with scratchy inked Latin, you begin to understand. Brewing was not just allowed, it was sanctified. Monasteries became centers of technical innovation, tracking hop strength, fermentation times, and barley-to-water ratios with the precision of modern engineers. Some even developed beer so nutritious it was referred to as liquid bread. That's right. Before you ever paid $9.99 for a protein shake, Brother Arnold was quietly chugging a hearty, yeasty brew thick enough to make chewing optional. But here's where it gets ironic. These monks, so disciplined and ascetic, often brewed stronger beer than their secular counterparts. Why? Because more alcohol meant more calories. And during a fast, calories were life. It was religious compliance and survival in one frothy mug. Historians still argue whether these fasting brews were intentionally potent or just a happy, heady accident. Of course, the average villager wasn't so lucky. Drinking beer outside of ecclesiastical approval could land you on a fast track to confession. And heaven forbid you drank during prohibited periods like Advent or Lent, unless, of course, you could afford a dispensation, a kind of divine hall pass. Think of it as spiritual bureaucracy meets craft beverage licensing. You settle onto a barrel, warmed by the flickering firelight, and listen as a novice monk explains the daily routine. Brewing begins at dawn with prayer and ends with evening psalms echoing over the clink of mugs. They take this seriously. One monastery even refused to alter their brew recipe for over 500 years, because why mess with perfection when the angels approve? Meanwhile, just beyond the monastery walls, townsfolk face a different brewing landscape. Alewives, mostly women, brew and sell low-alcohol beer from home. But unlike the monks, they're scrutinized, taxed, and occasionally shamed for their wares. The church worries that their loosely monitored brewing might lead to drunkenness, debauchery, or even gasp dancing. A town crier might announce that Brother Matthew's beer was suitable for fasting, but warn that Edna the alewife's hoppy temptation is a gateway to moral collapse. Never mind that Edna's been brewing longer than Matthew's been alive. The church loved order. Monasteries had it. Households, too chaotic, too female, too suspicious. And don't think this bias was subtle. Some records describe alewives being dragged before church courts for using witches' herbs in their recipes. Hops were fine. Wormwood, too occult. Lavender, too seductive. A spicy floral beer could be your ticket to a midnight dunking in the town river. Still, beer was everywhere. You drank it because water was often unsafe. You brewed it because it was part of the economy. Children drank small beer with barely enough alcohol to fog a gnat's vision. Adults favored stronger stuff, but not too strong, unless, again, you had a monk's blessing or no plans for Saturday morning confession. Curiously, not all monks agreed on beer's place in spiritual life. Some saw it as a divine gift, others as a slippery slope. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council debated excessive drinking among clergy. Let that sink in. Even they knew things were getting frothy. One bishop wrote that, "Many monks stagger from evening prayers, slurred in voice and soul." Historians still argue whether this was a widespread issue or just sour grapes from the local wine clergy. But let's not forget the sensory pleasures. The bubbling kettles, the warm, toasty smell of malted barley, the rhythm of stirring, like prayer with a wooden spoon. You imagine dipping a cup into a freshly drawn barrel, the foam thick and fragrant, the taste earthy and slightly sweet. The church may have made beer a matter of morality, but it couldn't erase the joy of a perfect pour. Back in the village, beer becomes part of your spiritual routine. You sip it during communal meals in the church hall. You offer it to friars during house visits. You bring it to festivals celebrating saints, many of whom, conveniently, were also brewers. Saint Arnold of Soissons, for example, is literally the patron saint of beer. He once encouraged people to drink beer instead of water to avoid plague. Medical advice or marketing? Hard to say. But beer wasn't just consumed. It was blessed. Monks would make the sign of the cross over casks. Some even dipped relics, bits of saints' bones, into the brew, as if holiness could be steeped like tea. Historians still debate the health implications of sipping fermented barley infused with femur shavings. But that's a sleep-deep rabbit hole for another night. You lean against the cool stone wall, the quiet hum of brewing and chanting mixing like a lullaby. You wonder, was this strict control comforting or constricting? For some, the rules offered rhythm and security. For others, they were just more ways to fail. But as you drift toward sleep, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just beer. It was theology in a tankard. It was salvation with bubbles. It was both the sin and the sacrament poured out by hands that believed and enforced the rules of heaven itself. You press your nose to the cool stone shelf of a cellar, peering down at rows of round, dusty cheeses resting like ancient scrolls waiting to be unwrapped. The air is damp, musky, and oddly comforting, earthy with a sharp edge of mold. But this isn't just a pantry. It's a battleground of belief, because in medieval Europe, even cheese could flirt with blasphemy. Yes, cheese. That harmless, melty, pizza-topping staple you barely question today was once a theological minefield. The church loved control, and control loved classification. So when it came to dairy, especially the kind that had undergone mysterious fermentation processes and occasionally looked like it had been aged in a wizard's sock drawer, the clergy had opinions. You reach out, gently now, and cradle a wheel of hard, crumbly white cheese. It smells faintly of nuts, hay, and something a little goatish. This one's probably safe. Church approved. In fact, the local abbot might even bless it before it's sold at the marketplace. But that blue-veined, pungent little devil in the corner, the one sweating gently under a cloth embroidered with a pagan swirl motif, that cheese might be excommunicated. Or worse, burned. Cheese was serious business. Monasteries became powerhouses of dairy production, refining techniques, experimenting with rennet ratios, and aging processes in underground chambers cooler than any modern cheese cave. In fact, many cheeses we know today, like Munster, Pont l'Evêque, or Tête de Moine, were originally monastic creations. These weren't snack foods. These were sacred formulas, regulated as tightly as sermons. Historians still argue whether this was culinary innovation, born of piety, or monks just getting bored between vespers. But for every cheese that entered heaven's pantry, another was deemed suspect. Why? Sometimes it was smell. Over-fermented cheese was thought to be unruly, like a woman who laughed too loudly in public. It couldn't be trusted. Theological texts warned against cheeses that ran without heat, or those that grew colors unnatural to God's spectrum. Translation: blue cheese, maybe demonic. Sometimes it was origin. Cow's milk was fine. Goat's milk? Tricky. Sheep's milk? Depends who you asked. And don't even think about mixing them. One obscure bishop reportedly banned beast-mixed cheeses, claiming they muddled God's intent for bodily purity. Yes, apparently hybrid dairy was the moral gray area of its time. But the real drama came during fasting periods. Cheese, rich in fat and flavor, was often forbidden alongside meat. But like with beer, loopholes flourished. Some clergy allowed soft cheese, others allowed aged, crumbled varieties. Then others, probably the most fun at dinner parties, declared that if the cheese was made before the start of Lent, it could be consumed without guilt. This led to a delightful black market of pre-Lenten cheese wheels being passed off with forged aging dates. You had to whisper to get your hands on a 40-day-old Gouda. Naturally, this encouraged cheating. Some cheesemakers salted their wheels excessively to fake age. Others crafted elaborate stories of miraculous preservation. One abbot proudly declared a wheel had been blessed into stasis by Saint Bridget herself. No one questioned the mold layer thick enough to qualify as a second crust. You walk now through a village market where cheese sellers eye passers-by nervously. One tucks a cloth over a particularly aromatic wedge. Another glances toward the chapel, hiding a slice of creamy brie behind a basket of apples. No one wants to get caught pushing unapproved dairy. There were fines, there were penances, there were, believe it or not, cheese trials. The church in some regions treated cheese like an alchemical substance. If it went wrong, someone had to be blamed. A spoiled batch might be attributed to moral laxity or improper prayers during milking. Monks who forgot their psalms before stirring the curds risked ruining an entire batch. Coincidence? Not in God's creamery. And speaking of psalms, some orders actually sang to their cheese as it aged. Chanting was believed to bless the fermentation, ward off evil bacteria, and possibly mice, and create a harmonious environment. Whether this affected the final flavor remains unclear. But let's face it, you'd totally try shan't-cured camembert if it were on a menu today. Still, not everything was solemn. You pass a group of children giggling as they shape soft cheese into animals, a lamb, a dove, something that might be a dragon. The church occasionally embraced cheese as part of religious festivals, especially around Easter. The lamb-shaped cheeses were symbolic, representing Christ and purity. Others, though, were more subversive. A 13th century record describes a nobleman's feast where cheese sculptures included miniature bishops and nuns in compromising poses. The bishop was not amused. Then there's the curious tale of blessed cheese stones, solid chunks of hardened curd that pilgrims would carry like relics, said to cure headaches, stomach aches, and the occasional lack of faith. They were popular trinkets, especially when dipped in holy water. Historians still argue whether these were spiritual tools or just glorified snack bars for the road. You round a corner and notice something odd. A statue of the Virgin Mary tucked into a niche above a dairy stall. The base is chipped, the paint faded, but someone has left a tiny wheel of cheese at her feet, a silent offering, a quiet prayer for good fermentation. In this world, sanctity and sustenance are braided together like a monk's belt cord. And as you walk on, the lines between sacred and smelly blur even more. Cheese isn't just food. It's a symbol of devotion or defiance, a way to nourish the body or risk the soul. Whether it melts on bread or crumbles into soup, it carries with it centuries of suspicion and sanctity, all tucked into a rind. So tonight, as you lie back in the soft dark and think about the strange, holy power of dairy, ask yourself, if a monk blesses a cheese and no one is there to smell it, does it still count as sacred? You're halfway through a bowl of lukewarm porridge when the priest walks in, robes swishing, brows furrowed, and announces, "No meat today." It is Friday, and the Lord is watching. You swallow hard, not because you're guilty, but because you just remembered what's hiding in the stew pot. One very well-seasoned leg of lamb. Welcome to the tangled world of ecclesiastical fasting, a spiritual minefield in which the church dictated not only when you could eat, but what you could eat, how it had to be cooked, and in some cases, what species were spiritually safe to swallow. Now, we're not just talking about Lent. That's the celebrity of fast periods. But did you know that in medieval Europe, up to half the calendar year could be considered a fasting day in one way or another? Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, the days before saints' feasts, Ember Days, Rogation Days, Advent, and of course, Lent. It was a wonder anyone knew when they could chew meat at all. And when meat was off limits, the human mind did what it does best. it got creative. You walk now past a fishmonger's stall, but it's not cod or herring on display. No, the prized catch today is a plump, glistening beaver tail. That's right. The church, in one of its more slippery interpretations of natural history, declared that since a beaver's tail was scaly and aquatic, it could be considered a fish. So could otters. So could puffins, because they spent a lot of time in water and kind of tasted like fish if you squinted. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine zoological misunderstanding or a very convenient culinary loophole. But let's be honest. Who's turning down grilled puffin when you've been surviving on turnips and prayer? The loopholes didn't stop there. In Spain, capybara, those oversized, adorable swamp guinea pigs, were also declared fish. In Central Europe, barnacle geese, which were believed to grow on driftwood and fall into the sea, were considered aquatic enough for Lent. Yes, you could eat a goose if you convinced yourself it hatched from a tree. Medieval biology was very much vibes-based. And of course there was cheese. Or rather, the argument about whether cheese counted as a dairy product or a lesser meat. Some bishops allowed soft cheeses during fasts. Others insisted only the most austere curds be consumed. Then came the egg debates, in which entire councils of clergy tried to determine whether an unborn chick counted as meat or potential meat. The verdict? It varied. Wildly. You sit now at a peasant's table, a bowl of steaming broth before you. It smells like leeks and barley, but the real excitement lies beneath the surface. Is that eel? Yes, eel was an acceptable fasting food. So acceptable, in fact, that rich monasteries began hoarding eels, keeping them in backyard ponds like gourmet fast day treasure. Some even paid rents in eels. Imagine that. I can't pay this month, but how about 27 kilograms of wriggling moral gray area? Bathing in butter was out. Cooking in lard, heresy. But if you boiled your beans in fish stock, congratulations, you're still on track for heaven. This led to some very strange taste combinations and a suspiciously high number of stews that all started to smell like the bottom of a river. And heaven help you if you broke the rules. Punishments varied from public penance to enforced fasting without any food. A nobleman once caught eating lamb during Lent was forced to sponsor an entire year's worth of fish for the monastery kitchen, which, honestly, feels less like a punishment and more like an ancient seafood subscription. Of course, some took the rules very seriously. Anchorites, religious hermits, lived in stone cells, surviving on nothing but water, bread, and occasional beans. They saw fasting not just as obedience, but as a purification of the soul. And if you wandered near their cells with a ham sandwich, well, you were liable to get scowled at very hard. But others, not so much. You hear whispers now as you pass the tavern. A merchant's wife has been caught roasting pigeon on Ember Wednesday. The priest is furious. She claims she thought it was Thursday. She also claims the pigeon volunteered. It's all a bit suspicious. Still, food during fast periods wasn't entirely bleak. Resourcefulness led to an explosion of fish-based cuisine. Trout pâté, herring pie, almond milk fish stew, don't ask, and even imitation sausages made from crushed beans and eel fat. Monks wrote entire cookbooks dedicated to acceptable fasting foods, some so detailed they resembled spiritual cheat codes. Then there were white fasts, where not only meat but color was forbidden. Meals had to be plain, pale, and humble. No spices, no saffron, no fun. You ate like your soul depended on being the culinary equivalent of a beige wool sock. And the irony? Despite these restrictions, monks often ate better than peasants. Their fasting meals were multi-course affairs of delicate fish, soft bread, garden vegetables, and mild cheeses. The average farmer, meanwhile, was lucky if his Lent meant anything more than thin cabbage soup and salt. You pause now at the foot of a stained glass window, depicting Saint Benedict holding, is that a trout? Yes, and a wheel of cheese. This is a world where saints become food mascots, where religious devotion is measured in what you can't chew, and where flavor is a matter of doctrine. But all this regulation did something strange to people. It didn't just change their diet, it changed their perception of the body, the calendar, and the seasons. Time itself became structured by hunger and holiness. The body was a vessel, and every bite had the power to sanctify or spoil. So the next time you bite into a fish sandwich on a Friday, give a little nod to the monks, the mystics, and the mildly rebellious peasant who once hid a sausage under a cabbage leaf. Because in the church's hands, food wasn't just fuel. It was a test, a trap, and occasionally a puffin on a platter. You duck under a wooden lintel and step into a small chamber, dimly lit by tallow candles and thick with steam. In the center, a wooden tub glistens with warm, soapy water, and folded linens hang neatly on a bench nearby. It smells faintly of lavender, luxurious, almost sinful. And depending on your priest, it just might be. Because here in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was a theological balancing act. Cleaning your body? That was fine. But enjoying it? That's where the church started to get twitchy. It's a bit of a paradox, really. Christianity, especially early on, inherited Roman traditions that prized public bathhouses and regular washing. Yet, as the centuries turned and spiritual anxiety deepened, church leaders began warning that too much washing could invite vanity, lust, or, worst of all, idleness. The body, after all, was the battleground of sin. And what better way to tempt it than by soaking it in warm water while humming a secular tune? You dip your fingers into the tub, feeling the heat radiate up your arm. It's pleasant. Maybe too pleasant. In fact, some bishops were very clear. If your bath made you feel good, you might be opening the door to temptation. Pleasure in cleanliness must be suspect, one 11th century theologian wrote. Yes, he really said that. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread belief or just the rantings of a man who never figured out how to light a fire under his bathwater. Now, don't get it twisted. Medieval people did bathe. That myth about everyone being filthy for centuries is a little overcooked, but how, when, and why they bathed. That's where things got theological. Take Sunday baths, for instance. On paper, Sunday was a day of rest and spiritual reflection. But in practice, it became a popular time to bathe, especially for those preparing to attend Mass. This annoyed some church leaders who believed bathing on the Sabbath turned a sacred day into a spa day. Sermons were preached. Public notices were posted. Clean thy soul before thy skin, they urged. And public bathhouses? Oh, they were a whole separate drama. You step through the steam and into a larger building, once funded by a bishop, now filled with murmurs and the occasional splash. Men and women, separated by flimsy partitions or not at all, soak, scrub, gossip. There are herbs in the water, perfumes in the air. It's intimate, social, slightly risque, and for many, it's one of the only warm places in town during the winter. Naturally, the church grew suspicious. Bathhouses were often blamed for moral decay. Not because bathing itself was sinful, but because what happened after the bath might be. Many bathhouses doubled as informal social clubs. Some were even fronts for brothels. And suddenly, soaking your shoulders next to someone's giggling cousin turned into an ecclesiastical offense. You can almost hear the whispers in the confessional booth. "Forgive me, Father, for I bathed too long," and she brought scented soap. But it wasn't just about lust. Bathing was also tied to pride, to wealth, to showing off. A well-scrubbed face could signal vanity. A perfumed tunic could stir envy. A particularly enthusiastic scrub with rose oil might draw the side eye of your local friar. So cleanliness became a symbol of spiritual risk. The church wasn't banning baths, it was cautioning against the culture that surrounded them. Still, there were exceptions. Sick people were allowed to bathe. Pilgrims, too, especially if their journey left them so crusty they might defile a holy relic with their presence. And monks? Monks bathed on a schedule. Once a week for some orders, once a month for stricter ones, but not too hot and never too long. Then came the theological justifications. Some tried to frame bathing as spiritual metaphor, washing the body as a symbol of baptismal purity. That was fine. But if the metaphor turned into a hot oil massage and someone lit incense, suddenly you were in trouble. One French bishop famously declared that a woman who added herbs to her bath without medicinal purpose was scenting herself for Satan. Another, in England, warned against excessive foot washing, which he claimed enticed idle thoughts. You can't make this stuff up. Of course, not all church figures agreed. Saints like Hildegard of Bingen wrote about the healing power of warm water. Monasteries often had their own bathhouses, simple, unadorned, but clean. Some friars even recommended washing the feet of the poor as an act of humility. So again, it's not that bathing was banned, it was just heavily, awkwardly spiritualized. You pass a family huddled around a small wooden tub, pouring ladles of warm water over their heads by candlelight. This is not indulgent, it's survival. Bathing helped prevent lice, soothe sore muscles, and keep infections at bay. And yet, because the church controlled the moral narrative, they did it in silence, avoiding scented oils or laughter that might imply they were enjoying it. And then there's the matter of baptisms, those religious baths that the church absolutely loved. Babies dipped in sanctified water, adults submerged in rivers. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but only if it was ritual cleanliness. Practical, physical cleanliness, that was more complicated. One sermon even warned against scrubbing the flesh to a gleam while the soul remains dull and fouled. It's poetic, also a bit judgy. Eventually, the Black Death would reshape bathing culture again, but we'll save that for later. For now, you sit beside a still tub, steam curling around your cheeks, and marvel at a time when warm water could either cleanse your soul or condemn it. So next time you step into a hot shower and hum a Taylor Swift song, take a moment of silent gratitude. You live in a world where soap is a personal choice, not a theological gamble. And back in the Middle Ages? Well, sometimes the cleanest people had the dirtiest reputations. You follow the clink of tankards and the yeasty aroma of barley down a narrow alley, ducking beneath a low archway carved with two words, God's foam. Inside, a handful of monks in hooded robes tend copper kettles, but there's something new in the air. Trouble. Because just across the square, another kind of brewer is setting up shop. She's not wearing a robe. She's wearing a kerchief, and her name is Agnes the Alewife. Now the church may have smiled warmly on monastic brewers, those disciplined, Gregorian chanting fermentation nerds, but it was far less enthusiastic about women brewing ale in their kitchens and selling it to their neighbors. And yet, for centuries, that's exactly who did it. You sit on a bench outside Agnes's home. She's stirring a pot of bubbling mash over an open fire, the smell thick with hops and smoke. Chickens peck at spilled grain. A child tosses pebbles into a bucket, and Agnes is brewing her livelihood. Alewives, women like her, were a staple of the medieval economy. Brewing was seen as domestic labor, like bread baking or spinning. It was done in the home, usually in small batches, and sold to the community. No big deal, right? Well, until the church and the town guilds decided it was a big deal. The shift began when beer became profitable. Suddenly, what was once women's work transformed into a male-dominated trade. And that's when regulation and judgment came knocking. Historians still argue whether this transition was economic necessity or good old-fashioned sexism wearing a cassock. You lean back and watch Agnes pour her ale into clay jugs. Her brew is cloudy, slightly sour, and delicious. It won't keep long, no preservatives, but it warms the belly and soothes the ache of winter. But if her measurements are off, or if someone finds her ale too thin, she could be hauled before the ale tasters. Local officials backed by church authority, tasked with ensuring moral and commercial quality. Yes, moral quality. Because it wasn't just about taste, it was about propriety. Alewives who sold beer deemed too strong were accused of tempting men into sin. Those who laughed too loudly or flirted while pouring were called brew wenches and marked as immoral. A few were even rumored to be witches, simply because their brew foamed too much, or because their cats hung around the barrels. You pass a notice nailed to the church door. Agnes fined 2 groats for impure ale. No one says what made it impure. Too bitter? Too cloudy? Too much joy? Meanwhile, the monastery's beer gets served at every feast, blessed by bishops, and stored in cellars so deep you need a torch and a rope to reach the good stuff. There's a tension in the town now. On feast days, both Agnes's and the monks' beers are drunk with gusto. But only one is seen as virtuous. The monks brew for sustenance and piety. The alewife, she brews for coin, and for that she's suspect. Still, you notice something clever. Agnes leaves a small bowl of ale outside her door each morning. For the saints, she winks. It's part reverence, part insurance. If the local priest passes by, he sees the offering and maybe, just maybe, looks the other way when she waters down her last batch. Church records show women like Agnes being summoned for everything from selling on Sundays to splashing their wares too provocatively. Splashing, as if a bit of foam was the devil's own advertisement. And yet, alewives were indispensable. They kept communities hydrated when water wasn't safe. They made ends meet. They supported their families, their churches, even their priests, who, if we're being honest, probably enjoyed a mug or two in private. You glance over at Agnes's sign, a broomstick hanging above her door. It means she has ale for sale today, but it also might get her accused of witchcraft, depending on who's doing the watching. The image of the alewife and the image of the witch started to blur. Both worked with herbs. Both wielded strange knowledge. Both stood at the margins of religious respectability. And here's the twist. Some of the church's own saints were beer patrons. Saint Bridget of Ireland was said to have turned her bathwater into beer for visiting clergy. Saint Arnold encouraged beer over water to avoid plague, but no one ever accused them of improper brewing methods. Funny how sainthood can sanitize anything. Back in the square, Agnes's customers are lining up. Her beer is better than the monk's this week, spicier, with a hint of rosemary. She smiles, pours, jokes with a miller about his wife's appetite for ale. A priest walks by and tuts. Agnes lowers her voice and murmurs, "He drinks it too, just won't bless it." The hypocrisy is almost amusing, if it weren't so exhausting. You sip the last of your mug and let the warmth settle into your bones. This isn't just a drink. It's survival. It's defiance. It's fermented female resistance. And yet, it's being slowly squeezed by guild rules, clerical pressure, and whispered reputations. In a few decades, Agnes's daughters will find it harder to brew without permits. Eventually, the alewife will vanish from the village square, replaced by official taverns, taxed barrels, and licensed monks. But tonight, the broomstick still hangs, the kettle still bubbles, and a woman's hands still shape something sacred from barley, water, and quiet rebellion. Because in this world, brewing is more than a craft. It's a line between virtue and vice, and who gets to cross it? That, apparently, depends on whether you chant Latin while you stir. The morning sun glints off copper pots as you step into a modest home where the hearth is already crackling. A kettle whistles, not with tea, but with water soon destined for something far holier than porridge. Baptism is coming, and with it, the quiet battle over who controls the hot water. It sounds simple enough, doesn't it? Heat some water. Pour it gently over a baby's head. Everyone smiles, sings a hymn, and perhaps slips the priest a little extra coin for the special occasion. But in medieval Europe, where the church held sway over both the sacred and the scalding, even Bathwater became a battleground. You walk past a heavy wooden font, cool and dry for now. It will soon be filled with water drawn from the village well, hauled in buckets, and carefully warmed, but not too much. Because the church had a very particular relationship with water. It must be pure, it must be intentional, and, depending on the diocese, it must not be too comfortable. In fact, some church leaders warned that water used for baptism should never be heated, fearing it would encourage indulgence or diminish the sanctity of the act. Others, especially in colder climates, allowed a little warmth. After all, no one wanted to christen a screaming infant blue in the face from hypothermia. Historians still argue whether the no warm water crowd won out in most regions, or if practicality quietly overrode piety in most cases. The records are spotty. Babies don't leave diaries, but the ambiguity didn't stop the regulations from piling up. Some parishes required baptismal water to be drawn at dawn. Others insisted it be taken from a specific well, one blessed by St. Eustace, or untainted by the sins of nearby livestock. In coastal towns, there were even debates about using seawater, which naturally led to the theological cliffhanger. If you baptize someone with salt water, are they extra preserved? You chuckle now, imagining a fishmonger's child being dipped into brine, while a bishop mutters about purification and pickling in the same breath. But the holy waters weren't just for baptism. They were rationed, regulated, and revered. Monasteries kept special cisterns filled with sanctified water, used not just for ceremonies, but for blessings, exorcisms, and occasional healing rituals. It wasn't the same water used for drinking or laundry. Heaven forbid someone washed their tunic in what had once graced the brow of a newly anointed child. And when droughts hit, or wells went bad, suddenly, even the holiest rituals had to pause. There's a recorded incident from a German village where baptisms were delayed for weeks because the priest refused to bless water that had been boiled. Too human, he said. God's water must come from the earth, not from fire. Which is poetic, and also inconvenient. You hear the murmur of an argument now from the back of the chapel. A young mother, exhausted and barefoot, pleads with a deacon. Her baby is sick. She needs a baptism quickly. But it's not Sunday, and the priest is reluctant. The water hasn't been blessed yet. Regulations, calendars, authority. Meanwhile, the infant wheezes. Eventually, of course, exceptions were made. Emergency baptisms became a sanctioned practice, especially during plagues and famine. Midwives were even authorized to perform them in some regions, using any water they could find: river, rain, even snowmelt. The church called it conditional. God, one hopes, called it compassionate. You pass through a vestry now, where jugs of water sit on a shelf. Each is labeled in Latin: aqua benedicta, aqua fontes, aqua mortua. Holy water, font water, water for the dead. Yes, there was specific water for last rites too. When someone was dying, a priest would sprinkle or anoint them with blessed water, sometimes carried across villages in sealed containers like sacred delivery parcels. In cold winters, the water froze. Priests had to chip it with knives and rub it gently on foreheads like melting relics. Faith didn't stop for frostbite. But not all holy water stayed holy. Once used, it had to be disposed of respectfully, poured into the earth, never into a drain. Tossing used baptismal water into the common sewage was considered sacrilege. A bishop in 1281 excommunicated a monk for cleaning baptismal basins in the same bucket he used for washing chamber pots. Reasonable? Maybe. Overdramatic? Definitely. Back in the home, you find a woman boiling water to clean her child's cradle. She pauses and adds a drop of holy water, just in case. Protection, she says. She doesn't know if it works, but it feels right. That's the thing about regulation. It starts as doctrine, then becomes habit, then finally settles into ritual so deeply rooted you don't question it. And yet, the water itself hasn't changed. It's just water, maybe a little cleaner, maybe warmed over a hearth instead of under the sun. But it carries meaning, weight, rules, and repercussions, and all of that is human. You step outside into the crisp air. The church bell tolls. A new baptism begins. The priest lifts the baby, a soft gurgle escaping its lips, and pours lukewarm water over its forehead. The congregation sighs. Maybe the water came from a distant spring. Maybe it was drawn yesterday. Maybe the priest forgot the blessing and is winging it. No one knows. But in that moment, it feels holy, because in medieval life, water wasn't just a substance, it was a symbol, a responsibility, and sometimes a quiet rebellion against the cold. So next time you fill a bathtub, rinse your hands, or take a sip from the tap, just remember, you're touching what generations once argued over, prayed over, and feared misusing. All in the name of keeping a baby from sneezing during a sermon. You're standing in a barn. Not a particularly glamorous place, but the scent of hay, cow breath, and something unmistakably cheesy fills the air. A small window lets in light that lands squarely on a wooden crate labeled with the bishop's seal. Inside, cheese, again. But not just any cheese. This is tithe cheese. Because in medieval Europe, the church didn't just regulate your dairy intake. Sometimes it took a bite out of it, literally. Yes, we've arrived at that curious corner of ecclesiastical economics where cheese was currency. You owe the church a tenth of your harvest, your flock, your honey, and your dairy. This meant, for many peasants, that every year they had to portion out a chunk of their best cheese and deliver it to the local clergy. Not the weird, lumpy experiment you forgot in the attic. No, they wanted the good stuff. You squat beside a wheel of sheep's cheese and notice it's stamped with a wooden brand shaped like a cross. That's no accident. Some churches required that all cheese paid as tithe be marked to distinguish it from secular, unblessed curd. Because nothing says holy obligation like carving a symbol of salvation into a wheel of Gouda. But things get weirder. In some dioceses, the church banned goat cheese outright. Too sour, too coarse, too associated with wild, unregulated herders. Goat cheese, they said, was the cheese of the untamed. Cow's milk? Gentle. Godly. Goat's milk? Unpredictable. Possibly satanic. Historians still argue whether this was based on dietary preference or deeper symbolism. Goats, after all, had long been linked with pagan rituals and devilish imagery. You know, just casual goat slander. You rise and walk toward the manor's granary, where tithes are stored in careful stacks, bushels of grain, clay jars of honey, and cheese wrapped in cloth, slowly aging under the watchful eyes of church-appointed tithe collectors. These were not people you wanted to cross. Too little cheese? You were fined. Cheese with a crack in the rind? Rejected. One farmer was penalized for trying to pay with a wheel that had the odor of mildew and the mark of a mouse. That's medieval code for you tried it. And it wasn't just peasants who suffered. Local lords were sometimes required to contribute cheese as part of their broader feudal obligations. Imagine being a powerful baron and having to send a wagon full of cheddar to the bishop once a year, like some lactose-powered tax return. The church didn't care how big your sword was. They wanted their cheese. You reach the monastery kitchen, where a young monk is slicing thin wedges for supper. He handles each piece carefully, whispering what sounds like a prayer. Not uncommon. Some orders believe that cheese received in tithe had to be blessed before consumption, to cleanse it of the sin of reluctance. The idea was that no one gave away their cheese joyfully, so it might carry bitterness. And bitterness, as everyone knows, curdles holiness. Then there's the tale of the cheese miracle. A 12th century document tells of a wheel of cheese gifted to a poor priest during Advent. It was so perfectly round, so sweet-smelling, that it was declared a sign of divine favor. Until someone noticed the farmer's initials burned into the bottom, clearly a wheel he'd hidden under the altar weeks before to avoid paying. The cheese was confiscated. The farmer did 3 weeks of penance. The priest kept the cheese. Morals were debatable. But tithes weren't just about payment. They were about power. When the church controlled your dairy, it controlled part of your sustenance. And sustenance meant survival. Refusing to pay, or even delaying, could result in excommunication. Or worse, your name read aloud during Sunday Mass with a note about withheld dairy. Imagine the shame. Your neighbor's turn, whispering, "He kept the butter again." Some bishops even used cheese tithes to fund church repairs. In one Flemish village, the local chapel was roofed using the proceeds from a year's worth of Alpine cheese. Imagine explaining that at the pearly gates. I kept the rain out with the power of Emmental. But not all interactions were so transactional. There were festivals, cheese fairs in fact, where farmers brought their finest wheels to the church courtyard, competing for blessings and contracts. If your cheese was praised by the bishop, it could mean increased demand, higher prices, and even protection from seasonal taxes. A holy endorsement was the medieval equivalent of a Michelin star. You pause now before a carved wooden chest. Inside are wheels of aged cheddar wrapped in waxed cloth. A record book nearby lists names, weights, and sins forgiven. One entry reads, Martin, for a wheel of smoked used cheese, granted indulgence for cursing at his neighbor's pig. We all cope in our own ways. You leave the granary and stroll past a cluster of children playing with cheese rinds like toy wheels, giggling and shrieking as one spins perfectly down the path. It's easy to forget, amid all the bureaucracy and pious accounting, that cheese was still part of daily life, something to be shared, savored, even celebrated. But the church had a gift for turning nourishment into narrative. Cheese wasn't just dairy. It was duty. It was devotion. It was leverage. So tonight, when you slice into that humble block of cheddar, think about Martin's pig. Think about the goat cheese bands. Think about the monk whispering a blessing before each bite. And remember, in a world where the line between holy and hungry blurred daily, your dinner could be part of a much larger story. And your cheese? Always better aged in both time and silence. You enter the cool stone nave of a centuries-old church where the air smells faintly of beeswax and ancient wood. Sunlight pours through high-stained glass windows, casting colored halos on the floor. In one quiet corner, behind a thick velvet curtain, a small door leads to the cellar. You descend carefully, the stone steps slick with time. Down here, in the hushed gloom, sit barrels of beer. Because while most people came to church for salvation, a select few came for the brew in the basement. You brush your hand along the curved side of a cask. The wood is dark, the iron hoops rusting slightly, but the contents, sacred in their own way. The monks have been brewing for generations, each batch following a recipe passed down like a holy relic. The walls down here hold more than moisture. They hold secrets. Beer appears in scripture, you know. Sort of. Not always directly named, but hinted at. Ancient Hebrew texts mention strong drink, fermented grain, vessels of barley, and early church scholars, many of them Mediterranean wine drinkers, were a little reluctant to talk about beer as anything more than what those barbarian northerners drank. Still, necessity changed minds. In places where grapes refused to grow, but grain flourished, beer became the holy default. Some theologians called it the gift of the North. Others wrinkled their noses and called it peasant's drink. But when you needed calories, hydration, and a safer alternative to bacteria-laced water, beer was divine mercy, especially if it came from behind monastery walls. You take a deep breath. The scent is thick with hops, yeast, and that deep, earthy tang of fermentation. And still, there's disagreement among the clergy. Some embraced beer as a tool of piety. Others saw it as a temptation, a trap. One bishop reportedly scolded a young monk by saying, "You pray like Saint Benedict, but drink like Bacchus," which, if we're honest, is quite a compliment. Historians still argue whether beer was truly seen as sacred or merely tolerated. Some abbeys brewed under the official pretense of supporting the poor or feeding the sick. Others leaned in fully, erecting massive brewing halls, refining techniques, even exporting to nearby villages under papal license. But while monks brewed with spiritual purpose, common folk faced stricter scrutiny. A cobbler brewing beer in his shed? Fine. But if he claimed it had healing properties, the local priest might accuse him of heresy, or worse, witchcraft. The sacredness of beer was conditional, location-specific, and always male-dominated. You duck beneath a low arch and find a row of clay cups on a bench, some still stained with dregs. A page torn from an old book rests nearby, detailing psalm verses, followed by brewing notes. It's not unusual. Some monks believed brewing could be synchronized with prayer, every stage timed by the liturgy. Mash during matins, ferment during sext, taste test, well, whenever the abbot wasn't looking. But not everyone was impressed. Reformist preachers occasionally thundered from pulpits about drunken priests and lazy brethren, accusing certain monastic orders of spending more time perfecting their ale than saving souls. One even wrote a pamphlet titled On the Perils of the Pious Pint. It didn't sell well. Meanwhile, theological debates brewed alongside the ale. Was beer symbolic? Could it represent divine joy, as wine did? Or was it just functional? Some clerics tried to claim beer could never be used in the Eucharist. It wasn't grape-derived, and thus lacked the blood-red symbolism. Others suggested that, for northern communities, local adaptations were spiritually acceptable. In fact, there's a letter, now faded and smudged, where a frustrated Irish priest pleads with his bishop to allow oat beer communion because no vineyard lies within 1,000 miles. The bishop's reply, a polite but firm no, accompanied by a shipment of sour wine that arrived 6 months later, completely spoiled. Cheers. But beer wasn't just theological, it was medicinal. Monastic texts often describe brews steeped with herbs for healing: chamomile, sage, rosemary. In one German abbey, a brew called Saviour's Tonic was given to feverish novices and elderly monks. Whether it cured anything is debatable. Whether it made them feel better? Almost certainly. You find a pew and sit for a moment, imagining the dual life this building once led: prayer above, fermentation below. Two kinds of devotion, really. One for the soul, the other for the stomach. And sometimes they overlapped, like during feast days. High holidays often included celebratory drinking, moderate, of course. Monks brewed special festive batches, richer in flavor, higher in alcohol. These were poured into wooden mugs etched with saints' symbols, passed hand to hand under watchful icons. And while priests publicly warned against overindulgence, let's just say a lot of sermons the next morning were shorter than usual. Outside of monasteries, beer also played a role in parish events. Weddings, christenings, harvest blessings, all included a keg or two. The priest might frown if things got rowdy, but secretly, he probably had a personal favorite brew and a trusted source. Then, inevitably, came the push for regulation. The church began to issue rules. No brewing on holy days, no selling ale near church steps, no drinking during sermons. Yes, that happened. In some towns, priests walked the streets to inspect brewing equipment, sniffing pots like amateur sommeliers. If your brew smelled too merry, you were fined. But inside these stone walls, in the silent shadow of saints, beer remained paradoxically holy and profane, a source of comfort, a subject of suspicion, a daily ritual brewed in the gaps between prayers. So as you make your way back up the cellar stairs, the cool, barrel-scented air lingering on your cloak, you reflect on the strange duality. Beer that brought both judgment and joy. Liquid that connected heaven and hearth. A drink once feared and revered in equal measure. And if you ever wondered whether God liked beer, well, someone once said he gave us hops and yeast. That sounds suspiciously intentional. The scent hits you first: wet stone, burned wood, and the unmistakable sharpness of lye-soaked linen. Then, as you pass beneath a crumbling brick archway, the true source emerges. A public bathhouse. Large tubs, steaming gently, line the walls. Pale light from high slits in the stone ceiling dances on the water's surface. It's calm, quiet, almost sacred. And yet, the church doesn't quite know what to do with this place. You move past patrons wrapped in linen towels, men and women in separate rooms, well, sometimes separate, chattering softly, scrubbing feet, oiling hair. One woman laughs. Somewhere, someone's humming a popular tavern song. You imagine the reaction of a stern-faced bishop walking in just then, scandalized, sweating, and very uncomfortable. Public bathhouses in medieval Europe existed in a kind of moral fog. On one hand, they were undeniably useful. In towns without plumbing, this was where people got clean, soothed sore muscles, and maybe even found a little community. On the other hand, the church worried they were a slippery slope, literally and spiritually. Remember, pleasure, in many clerical eyes, was already suspicious. And water? Well, that had to be cold, austere, purposeful, not hot, bubbly, and social. Add in the fact that people often ate in bathhouses, played music, or, heaven forbid, flirted, and suddenly, these warm water havens were branded as dens of temptation. By the 13th century, church sermons were regularly lashing out against balnea communes, communal baths. Not always for nudity, mind you, though that definitely came up, but for what they represented: leisure, choice. The ability to relax outside of ecclesiastical supervision. And that made church leaders deeply uneasy. You listen now as a deacon in the corner warns a young apprentice, "Too much time in the bath and your soul becomes soft, like boiled bread." Odd image, but the message is clear: discipline, not indulgence. And yet, records show that some clergy secretly bathed quite frequently. Bishops had private tubs. Monks, especially in southern climates, soaked on a schedule. Even the Pope, in Avignon, was known to bathe in scented water. But for the common folk, mixed messaging. Public bathhouses were fine until they weren't. They were recommended, then restricted, encouraged, then condemned. Historians still argue whether the church truly wanted people to stop bathing, or simply wanted more control over where and how they did it. A bathhouse with prayers and a priestly presence? Acceptable. One with candles, music, and mixed-gender tubs? Risky. You glance around. The bathhouse is mostly quiet now. A friar enters, unsure whether to remove his shoes. He dips a toe in, frowns, mutters something about worldly comforts, and leaves. Behind him, a group of women help an elderly man into the water. They scrub his back gently, speaking to him in soothing tones. This scene, compassion, community, cleanliness, doesn't look sinful, but under church doctrine, appearances could deceive. A 14th century Parisian decree banned singing and lounging in public baths during Lent. One can only imagine the enforcement. A priest lurking by the changing room with a scroll of sins and a dripping quill. Worse still, some bathhouses became scapegoats for disease. During outbreaks of plague and sweating sickness, they were shuttered. Not because of germs, those weren't really understood yet, but because illness was seen as punishment. And pleasure, it was feared, invited divine wrath. In this atmosphere, bathhouse culture began to shrink. Some closed entirely. Others were required to post moral codes by the door. No drinking, no touching, no unsupervised minors. One particularly creative town required patrons to recite a psalm upon entry. Spiritual hygiene to match the physical. Still, the bathhouses adapted. In quieter towns, they operated at dawn or dusk, in secret, or under the cover of festival days. Some attached themselves to churches, rebranding as healing stations or purification houses. It was a delicate dance of compliance and defiance. But not all opposition came from the church. As medical knowledge slowly evolved, physicians started debating the health impacts of frequent bathing. Some insisted warm water opened the pores to disease. Others claimed it expelled bad humors. One Italian doctor declared that a bath once per month was sufficient for gentlemen of spirit. We can only imagine the odor of those spirited men. Back in the bathhouse, a little boy splashes his feet. His mother scolds him gently. A woman nearby pours a jug of herbal water over her head, rosemary and mint. You catch a whiff and suddenly understand why the church got nervous. It smells divine. There's a story from London, probably apocryphal, about a priest who banned bathing during Holy Week. The townspeople complied, and then promptly staged a cleansing riot the following Monday, storming the bathhouse in joyful rebellion, dunking each other in barrels, and singing lewd songs about cleanliness. The priest was horrified. The bishop laughed. Ultimately, it wasn't the church alone that shut down public baths. Plague fear, changing urban layouts, and increased emphasis on privacy all played a role. But the moral murkiness surrounding them never truly lifted. You leave the bathhouse now, warm and drowsy, stepping into the cooler night air. Your skin tingles, your limbs are soft, and your soul still intact. Because really, was it such a sin to soak with neighbors? To rinse off dust and sweat after a week of labor? To feel, just for a moment, human and clean? Maybe, in a world where the sacred and the sensual were always at war, the bathhouse was the one place they met and said, "All right, 5 minutes." Then back to church. The fog rolls low as you wander down a village path, past a shuttered bakery and the last flicker of candlelight from a chapel window. It's quiet tonight, too quiet. A few dogs bark in the distance, uneasy. And you? You're here to witness one of the strangest rituals in medieval history, the intersection of plague, penance, and pickled hygiene. Yes, things are about to get a bit damp, a bit desperate, and just a little bit fermented. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it shattered confidence in kings, in doctors, and in the body itself. When the church found its prayers unanswered and its holy relics failing to stop the tide of death, it turned its gaze on something closer, cleaner, sort of. Water. Bathing, which had once teetered between salvation and sin, now took on an air of suspicion. Some claimed it opened the pores to bad air, making the body vulnerable to divine punishment in microbial disguise. Others clung to cleanliness with a new religious fervor. As always, medieval theology was a battlefield of contradictions. You find yourself beside a barrel of water infused with vinegar and rosemary. A friar stands over it, stirring slowly, muttering something halfway between a recipe and a prayer. This isn't soup. It's a purification bath for hands, faces, tools, and sometimes corpses. During outbreaks, churches developed entire protocols. Holy water was no longer used freely. Too risky. Instead, priests sprinkled cleansed water made with wine vinegar and sometimes salt. It wasn't medically effective, but it felt right. People bathed in it, washed their clothes in it, dabbed it behind their ears before stepping outside. And when the bathhouses closed, due to fear of infection, people began creating DIY rituals, foot washing with garlic, steam tents filled with herbs. A priest in Bavaria swore that soaking in brine cured plague boils. Another in Italy claimed that sleeping beside a pot of boiled onions would draw out death's vapors. Historians still argue whether any of this worked, or whether it was just desperate theater in a collapsing world. You step into a stone-walled room where 3 women are kneeling, scrubbing a stone floor with rags soaked in what smells like ale. Not beer, ale. Fermented, frothy, weak enough to drink, but acidic enough to sanitize. Sort of. In some towns, church orders were issued requiring ale to be used for cleaning sickbeds. The logic was that if monks drank it to survive fasting, it could clean linens too. One recipe, penned in the margins of a psalter, lists a death-defying blend: stale beer, clove, vinegar, and ashes from blessed palm fronds. This mix was used to wipe down everything from altars to the hands of midwives, and people believed in it. Because when everything else failed, what was left but faith and whatever was in the bottom of the barrel? Of course, penance played its part too. The church preached that plague was a punishment, collective and personal. People lashed themselves in public, hoping to cleanse sin from skin. They fasted obsessively. And yes, they bathed, if only to prepare for death. You spot a monk carrying buckets of water up the hill to the parish. It's heavy, cold, but he does it daily. The water is for the dying, not to drink, not to bathe fully, but to moisten lips, to rinse feet, to wipe foreheads. Symbolic cleaning. Last comforts. In some churches, washing the dead became sacred duty. The water was infused with rosemary and myrrh, and the process accompanied by scripture. Some priests insisted on full-body baths. Others only allowed washing of the face and hands, as Christ was bathed by his followers. There was debate about whether bathing a plague victim's body might spread disease. There was always debate. You lean against a crumbling wall and watch a boy wash his hands in a bucket by candlelight. His mother insists on it. Not for germs. Germs haven't been invented yet, at least not conceptually, but for moral reasons. She tells him that a clean hand is less likely to sin, that the plague smells the dirty ones first. It's heartbreaking. It's beautiful. It's complete nonsense. And yet, somehow, you understand it. Then there were the church orders to purify the air. Incense burners filled with lavender and sage were swung over congregations. Smoke drifted into the rafters, perfuming pews that would be empty the next week. Some monks believed that bathing feet in wine could ward off evil spirits. Others brewed thick pastes from pickled onions and mustard seeds to rub on chests. You can't help but laugh a little, not out of cruelty, but from the sheer inventiveness of it all. When the world fell apart, people tried everything, including bathwater rituals that, frankly, no dermatologist today would approve of. And yet, despite the confusion, something beautiful happened. Hygiene, fear, and faith collided into this strange dance. People cleaned not just out of fear, but as hope. Every time they washed a hand, wiped a brow, or bathed a body, they were saying, "Maybe this will be enough. Maybe this will save someone." And the church, for all its rules and contradictions, began to soften. Some priests allowed full baths again. Some encouraged the use of herbal remedies, previously condemned. One bishop even built a new bathhouse beside his cathedral, calling it a mercy for the afflicted. It was open only on Wednesdays, and Sundays, and feast days, which turned out to be most days, eventually. You walk now through that same bathhouse. It's quiet, abandoned for the night, but the tubs still hold water, slightly murky, smelling faintly of vinegar and mint. The last bather must have been hopeful, maybe scared, maybe both. And as you press your hand to the water's surface, the warmth reminds you, Sometimes faith doesn't look like incense and Latin prayers. Sometimes it looks like a parent washing a feverish child, or a nun boiling herbs at midnight, or a stranger bringing water to a door without being asked. So next time you draw a bath, or even just rinse your hands, think of those medieval souls who scrubbed their skin not just to stay clean, but to keep believing. Because in the end, even pickled hygiene can be a form of prayer. A sharp scent curls through the air as you open the heavy wooden door of a church kitchen. Cinnamon, cloves, a trace of nutmeg. Not the sort of fragrance you expect in a place that once banned laughter during Lent. But here it is, floating merrily over a table covered in bread, cheese, and a suspiciously fragrant beer that glows amber in the candlelight. Tonight's lesson? Not all flavor was welcome in the eyes of the medieval church. In fact, some spices were treated with more suspicion than sin itself. You trail your fingers along the edge of the rough-hewn table. The cook, a wiry nun with a stained apron and a stern expression, shoos you back from a pot of mulled ale. "This isn't just drink," she mutters. "It's blessed. Or it will be." She's not entirely joking. It started innocently enough. As spices like cinnamon, clove, and pepper made their way across trade routes from the east, they spiced up more than just food. They ignited curiosity, suspicion, and full-blown ecclesiastical panic. Why? Because the church believed strong flavors stirred the body, and anything that stirred the body too much might also stir the soul in the wrong direction. Take clove-stuffed cheese, for example. A French bishop in the 13th century famously banned it from Lent tables, saying its aromatic bite was too close to the thrill of sin. Yes, apparently a fragrant cheese could lead you straight to temptation. One monk was even accused of hoarding nutmeg during Advent, smuggling it into soup under the guise of healing herbs. Historians still argue whether this was simple flavor craving or a covert culinary rebellion. Meanwhile, the beer didn't escape scrutiny either. As monks refined brewing methods, some began adding exotic ingredients: saffron, coriander, dried orange peel. These beers were richer, more complex, and, according to one disgruntled abbot, more like potions than piety. You glance at the bottle before you. It's a dark glass, unlabeled, but inside swirls something not unlike modern craft beer. The flavor would likely floor a peasant, sweet, spicy, with a thick mouthfeel and a dizzying warmth that hints at more than just fermentation. This question. Mark, this could definitely get a friar in trouble. And it did. In certain regions, the church imposed restrictions not only on when beer could be brewed, but how. Some dioceses issued decrees banning frivolous additives. What qualified as frivolous? Pretty much anything that tasted better than bog water. No ginger, no fruit, no brews that remind the tongue of carnal pleasures. A German abbess wrote of one nun who added dried plums to her beer. She was publicly scolded and made to drink only water for a week, to remember the plain taste of virtue. And yet, in wealthier monasteries, exotic spices flowed freely. The contradiction was striking. If a poor cook spiced a stew too boldly, it was vanity. If a bishop did it, it was cultural sophistication. Back in the kitchen, the nun lifts a lid to reveal a loaf of bread studded with black pepper. It smells divine. But it's also forbidden? Perhaps. Pepper was sometimes labeled a fire of the blood. It increased appetite, both physical and spiritual. And that, as you've surely learned by now, was the medieval church's least favorite kind of appetite. This led to the creation of so-called cold dishes, not in temperature, but in temperament. foods that were bland, white, unscented. The church adored these during fast periods. Rice boiled in water, cheese curds rinsed until flavorless, bread made from unseasoned barley. Basically the culinary equivalent of Gregorian chant. Nourishing, yes, but not something you'd hum while baking cookies. But of course, people rebelled. Secret recipes emerged. Spice was hidden in pockets, stored in hollowed-out loaves, and added just before serving. Some cooks even created double dishes, one bland for public display, another richly seasoned for private indulgence. A clever cook could save a soul and season a sausage at the same time. You remember a story from Florence, half legend, half legal record, about a young baker who accidentally used aniseed during Lent. When the smell wafted through the town square, the bishop called it a scent too cheerful for morning. The baker? Fined. The townspeople? Famished and slightly delighted. So why were spices so dangerous? Because they were foreign, expensive, associated with the East, with trade, with power, and because they symbolized control over nature, turning something plain into something ecstatic. That, in the church's eyes, was a risky kind of alchemy. And yet, the line was always fuzzy. Church banquets, especially during feast days, were often lavish, spiced, and bursting with flavor. Roasted meats, pies with cloves, almond-studded cheeses, and honey-sweetened beer. For the upper clergy, indulgence had its place, as long as it was sanctioned, supervised, and accompanied by at least one apology to St. Paul. You pause by a shelf of clay jars, each labeled in Latin, Piper nigrum, cinnamomum, zingiber, mel, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, honey. Hidden within this neat row is a century of controversy, tastes that caused sermons, smells that sparked suspicion, flavors that fed both body and fear. One jar is unlabeled. The nun gives you a sly look. For feast days only, she says. You nod, knowing full well it'll find its way into tomorrow's soup. Because no matter how many rules the church made, people never stopped seeking flavor. In their food, in their drink, in their lives. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think of the poor friar sipping his secret cinnamon ale, the baker hiding pepper in his crust, the cheesemaker risking a sprinkle of clove for that perfect holiday wheel. And remember, sometimes salvation needs seasoning. You wake to the smell of something pungent, not exactly foul, but complex. A combination of earthy, sour, damp cloth in the cellar kind of complex. You follow the scent through a side corridor of the monastery until you find it. A larder stacked floor to ceiling with wheels of aging cheese, bowls of dried herbs, and rows of tallow candles, barely holding back the aroma. This place isn't dangerous, but according to the church, it might be morally compromising. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. In the medieval imagination, smell was never just smell. It was spiritual evidence. You lean over a wedge of blue-veined cheese, inhaling deeply. To the modern nose, it's gourmet. But to a 14th century cleric, that odor might indicate inner corruption. That's right. Your nose could be your soul's snitch. See, the church taught that foul smells were linked to sin. Decay, rot, excess, all had their own spiritual scent profile. You could smell pride, you could smell gluttony, and you could definitely smell lust. The 7 deadly sins weren't just concepts. They were, in a very real way, detectable through the nostrils. One bishop wrote that, "The devil does not whisper, he wafts." Subtlety was not a strength of medieval olfaction theology. You walk now past a nun sprinkling dried rosemary on a linen wrap of aging cheese. She's doing it half for preservation, half for purification. A nearby sign reads, "Let not your food offend the angels," and while that might sound metaphorical, it was taken seriously. A dinner table filled with funky cheeses, fish stew, and spiced ale was sometimes described in theological texts as a temptation to the senses. Historians still argue whether this sensory paranoia came from Scripture or just a few particularly sensitive noses in the hierarchy. But it didn't stop with food. People believed that their bodies gave off moral aromas. A holy man would smell sweet, like lilies or clean bread. A sinner, sour, sulfuric, the kind of smell that clung to skin and robes and reputation. There's even a documented case where a suspected heretic was judged partly by how offensive his sweat smelled during trial. Not joking. You touch a beeswax candle, noticing that it's been infused with bay leaf. That's not for show. In many monasteries, incense and scented candles were used not just to mask odor, but to combat evil. Demonic forces, it was said, disliked strong smells, especially myrrh, lavender, camphor. A monk once claimed that a demonic presence fled from his cell after he burned a clove-stuffed orange. We can't confirm the theology, but it definitely made the place smell better. This obsession with odor extended to daily life. Clergy were encouraged to wash regularly, not just for health, but so as not to offend the Holy Spirit. Breath, especially, was policed. Garlic before Mass, risky. Onions before confession, spiritually aggressive. And if someone smelled too good, think perfume, oils, overly fragrant soaps, that was also a red flag. You were vain, flirtatious, a threat. The ideal scent was mild, clean, monastic, like wet linen hung in a meadow. Not exactly a marketable fragrance, but deeply on brand for salvation. You remember a story from a Flemish abbey where a visiting bishop banned all aromatic food from the kitchens during Advent. His reasoning? The smells caused involuntary excitement of the tongue and of lesser flesh. Meaning, even the scent of grilled trout could be spiritually dangerous. One cook, reportedly, got so stressed he fainted into the soup pot. It wasn't all fire and brimstone, though. In some regions, scent was used positively. Churches burned frankincense during high masses, symbolizing prayers rising to heaven. Holy oils were steeped with herbs to anoint the sick and bless newborns. And saints? Oh, saints had a whole category of divine smell. Osmogenesia, yes, that's the real word, was the reported ability of a saint's corpse to emit a pleasant fragrance, even long after death. The body of Saint Teresa of Avila was said to smell like violets. Saint Dominic? Fresh bread. One chronicler described the tomb of Saint Cecilia as breathing holiness through rose and rain. The church didn't question these miracles. They cataloged them. You glance down now at your sandals. Dusty, slightly damp, and think, would I have passed the sniff test? A strange thought, perhaps. But in a world where spiritual virtue could supposedly be smelled, everyone was a walking incense burner. Even buildings were judged by their scent. Some medieval texts describe churches that smelled of heaven, while others reeked of negligence. One disgraced friar was said to have left behind a cell that smelled like sadness and spoiled milk. Back in the cheese room, the nun offers you a slice. It's sharp, crumbly, powerful. You close your eyes as it dissolves on your tongue. It tastes holy, but in the should I confess this sort of way. You wonder how many prayers were said over cheese like this, how many sermons whispered warnings about letting the tongue guide the soul. Because to the church, smell was more than sensation. It was symbol. It was doctrine. A tool to guide the flock, and sometimes to shame them. So tonight, as you drift off, remember that even in a time of candlelight and parchment, of silence and solemnity, the nose had its say. It judged cheese. It judged people. It might have even judged saints. And if you ever find yourself catching a strange whiff of something ancient, earthy, and vaguely theological, well, don't panic. It might just be the smell of salvation. You walk now into a space where the walls hum with the residue of 1,000 meals. Stone floors are worn smooth from centuries of movement, cloaked figures shuffling to and from ovens, monks muttering recipes, half prayer, half experiment. You're in a monastic kitchen, and it smells like restraint. At first, that's hard to believe. There are baskets of herbs, loaves of dark bread, even a string of smoked sausages hanging discreetly near the chimney. But look closer, and you'll see the pattern. Everything is measured, portion controlled, seasoned with precision. Because here, in the ecclesiastical kitchen, food was not pleasure. It was doctrine. In the medieval church, kitchens weren't just places for cooking. They were spiritual laboratories. What went in the pot had to be pure, not just clean, but morally acceptable. The ingredients were scrutinized, the cooks were often cloistered, and the meals planned with theological intent. A bell rings. It's time for the collation, the light evening meal permitted by many monastic rules. You're handed a small bowl of lentils, a piece of coarse bread, and, if the abbot is feeling generous, a spoonful of soft cheese. No seconds ever. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monasteries, laid out dietary restrictions in detail. No red meat, except for the sick. Limited wine, no overindulgence. A monk was to eat just enough to live, and never enough to enjoy. That was the line. But as you've learned by now, humans are squishy creatures, and rules tend to squish with them. You glance toward a stack of clay pots near the hearth, each one labeled not with a saint's name, but with cryptic abbreviations, PN, DV, SJM. You ask a passing kitchen brother. He blushes. Private batches, he says, for the feast days, or when the bishop visits. In other words, the good stuff. Because despite all the rules, church kitchens had their moments. On major feasts, Christmas, Easter, the feast of Saint Whoever, restrictions lifted. Rich meats were served, honey cakes appeared, wine flowed, sometimes from casks so large it took 4 novices just to tip one. And sometimes the line blurred altogether. There are records of monks debating whether stuffed pastries counted as 2 items or 1 cleverly folded one. Historians still argue whether this was innocent creativity or cheeky rebellion wrapped in dough. You kneel by the hearth. The ashes are still warm from the midday meal. A pot of barley stew simmers slowly, and an older monk stirs it with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Hearty, he says, but humble. And then, with a wink, we added leeks. Don't tell the abbot. You smile, but the stakes were real. Monastic kitchens had to account for every ingredient. Inventories were kept. Waste was discouraged, sinful even. One abbot once excommunicated a cook for allowing crusts to rot. Another forbade the consumption of fish that had not been cleaned while reciting the Psalms. You can't help but wonder, did Jesus really care about how loudly Brother Martin peeled turnips? But beyond the absurd, There's a beauty to it, a rhythm. Food was seen as a bridge between the physical and the divine. Each meal was an opportunity to temper the body and nourish the soul. You weren't just eating, you were training, resisting, honoring. Still, you come across a parchment pinned near the pantry, ink faded but legible. A list of permitted substitutions for Lent: eel for lamb, almond milk for cream, crushed walnuts for butter, and, most fascinating, bread made of ground peas and ashes in absence of grain. It sounds dreadful. You suspect it was, but it was permitted, and that made all the difference. And then, tucked in the corner, something entirely different, a joke. Scrawled in the margin of a recipe for carrot pottage, some long-dead cook wrote, "If thou burnest it again, Brother John, St. Lawrence shall not save thy backside." A rare spark of humor amid the fasting and fear. Proof that even within strict systems, the human spirit seasons. Later, you find a group of novices sitting cross-legged in the corner, quietly slicing onions for tomorrow's meal. They whisper about a rumor that the abbot once tasted a Moorish spice during pilgrimage and still dreams of it. A sacred temptation. One of them grins, then sneezes violently as a puff of pepper escapes the bowl. A moral reminder, if ever there was one. But let's not forget leftovers. Yes, even in the monastery, leftovers mattered. Some were redistributed to the poor, others reworked into soups or spread onto day-old bread, and some were, quite literally, buried. During certain fasts, food considered too luxurious was wrapped in cloth and entombed in cold ground as a sign of renunciation. This led to the bizarre phenomenon of resurrected stew, dishes dug up after feast days and eaten with solemn joy. You climb now to the roof, where herbs hang drying under wooden beams. Thyme, sage, mint, each one used not just for flavor, but for symbolism. Thyme for courage, sage for wisdom, mint to clear the breath before prayer. These weren't just ingredients. They were small, edible prayers. And you wonder, what would Jesus microwave? It's a question modern minds laugh at, but medieval theologians asked it seriously. What would Christ have eaten? How did he feel about salt? Would he approve of olive oil on bread during a vigil? Would he have declined the second helping? The answers, of course, varied wildly. Some said simplicity was the key. Others said generosity. Some took it to mean fasting. Others feasting. The kitchen, like everything else in the church, was a mirror of belief. Distorted, interpreted, debated. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine the quiet clatter of a spoon on a pot, a monk whispering a prayer as he stirs, a wheel of cheese being sliced just so, a pot of forbidden stew steaming on the windowsill, cooling for a feast day not yet here. Because sometimes the most sacred thing in the world is dinner. You step through the crumbling arch of a long-forgotten cloister, where ivy now creeps up the stones and the wind hums through broken, stained glass. The air smells of moss and time. You're standing in the remnants of a world where the church once decided how long you could soak your feet, how strong your beer could be, and whether your cheese had been aged in moral darkness. But now the silence speaks louder. This is the fading echo of religious regulation, where once proud rules dissolved into dust, and all those holy kitchen debates, ale taxes, and soap suspicions began to rot away, quietly, like last year's barley crop. You walk along the empty pews of a chapel that once doubled as a pantry during Lent. At the far end, a rusted iron ring still hangs on the wall, It once held a bucket of holy water, specially blessed to purify your cheese tithe. Now it holds spider webs and the ghost of 1,000 unspoken rules. By the 17th century, the church's grip on these strange domains began to slip. Not overnight, and not without protest, but gradually, the people changed. Cities grew. Science sniffed around the corners of superstition, and the world, no longer so afraid of rot or pleasure, began to redefine what was sacred and what was just lunch. One by one, the bans fell away. Cheese, no longer a theological litmus test, even goat cheese, once branded suspiciously devilish, became the star of markets from Paris to Prague. That sharp, earthy flavor was no longer a moral hazard. It was just Tuesday. Beer, freed from fasting loopholes and cloistered cellars, it flowed into taverns, across borders, through industrial pipes. Monks still brewed it, yes, but now they sold it, bottled it, marketed it. Some even trademarked their sacred recipes. Historians still argue whether that was spiritual evolution or just capitalism with a Benedictine label. Baths? They came roaring back. Cleanliness shifted from sin to science. As plumbing advanced and hygiene became medical rather than moral, the public bathhouse reemerged, first as luxury, then as common sense. The church no longer condemned hot water. It installed it. And what of the spices? The cinnamon, the clove, the scandalous pepper? They never left. They waited, hidden in cupboards, smuggled into stews, whispered into pies during feast days. When the rules loosened, they burst forth again, unapologetically joyful. By the Enlightenment, no one was burning cloves in secret. They were buying them in bulk. Of course, not all remnants vanished. Some monasteries still keep food rules. Some fast. Some chant over soup. And there are still people, quiet, devout, who pray before bathing, bless their cheese, and stir their beer with a reverent pause. But they do so by choice now. You find a small plaque half buried in the grass. It reads, "Here stood the Abbey of St. Coulina, devoted to temperance, silence, and lentil stew." There's a drawing beneath, a cartoonish wheel of cheese with a halo. Someone left a bottle of craft beer next to it, uncorked, half drunk. You smile, because that's what's left, really. The stories, the traces, a strange history of sacred soup and sinful soap, a time when flavor could be dangerous, and bathing might invite a sermon. You reach the edge of a quiet stream. Kneel. Dip your fingers into the cool water. It's clean, unblessed, unmeasured, no priest watching, no rules. And yet, somehow, it still feels holy. Because what the church once tried to control, your hunger, your thirst, your impulse to feel good and clean, those things were never really sins. They were just human. So now, as the sky fades to deep blue and the wind picks up through the old stones, remember, the rituals may be gone, but the weird beauty remains. The beer still bubbles. The cheese still ages. And the bathwater? Still warm. And now you lie back, comfortable, eyes soft, breath slow. The story has unspooled its final thread, and the world outside has gone quiet. Let the last echoes of ancient cheese wheels and candlelit tubs slip gently from your thoughts. The church, in its time, tried to wrap its fingers around the most ordinary corners of life. Your meals, your drinks, even your soap. It tried to make sense of chaos through rules, through rituals, through sacred calendars tied to turnips and barley. But in the end, it was never about control alone. It was about meaning. a longing to find sacredness in the daily, in the tangible. And whether or not the rules were strange or strained, that longing is something you understand, even now, especially now. So let your body sink deeper. Let your muscles soften like butter left too long near the fire. Let the rhythm of your breath take over where the story leaves off. You've traveled through fasts and feasts, cellars and sanctuaries. You've met nuns with pepper pots and monks who whispered over barrels. And you've made it through the only war ever waged over Bathwater. The candles are out. The cheese is cut. The beer has gone flat. But here you are, still quiet and very much at peace. Thank you for spending this time here. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may your next bath be warm, your next ale be cold, and your next cheese mildly heretical.